Today, I'm going to do a Go code roast. That is, I'm going to roast some Go language code. I'm going to pretend that I'm looking at this code as though I am considering the candidate who wrote it for a job application. Hello, everyone. I'm Jonathan Hall. Thanks for watching. If you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe. And if you find this video interesting or entertaining, please be sure to like it. So a few weeks ago, I published a request on LinkedIn to ask a few people to submit some examples of code, and I got a couple responses. So I'm going to dive into one of those, and we're going to see. I'm going to roast the code. We're going to see if I would give this candidate a thumbs up or a thumbs down based only on this piece of code they've written in Golang. Let's go. Okay, so this is my first time to see the code. I mean, I pulled up this page before, but I haven't looked at any of the source code yet. So this is my first time to see this. So I'm going to just look through it and comment verbally as I go through. And yeah, let's see what I find here. So usually the first thing I do when I look at some code that's been submitted during a job interview is, of course, I look at the README and see what it says. I try to get a feel for what the code is. If it's an assignment that I've sent out, of course, I probably already know what it's about, but I like to see what the candidate says anyway. So Signature Server is a REST API server written in Go that stores transaction blobs and strings and signs them, typo there, using ED 25519 key. So use public-private key encryption. To set up, you modify config.json. Okay, so they're using JSON as a config file. I don't like that very much, but that's not really what I'm talking about today. Talk here a little bit about how it executes things, reads the PEM files, the tools used. It uses the Gin framework. That's fine. BadgerDB. I think I've heard of that, but I'm not really familiar with it. I'm actually going to pull that up here and see what that is. BadgerDB. Where's the README here? BadgerDB is an ensemble, persistent, and fast key value database written in pure Go. So it's just a pure Go key value store, apparently. Good enough. API documentation. So you can do a GET request. You can to get a key. You can store the blob. Uses all the cores of it. So it uses standard Go features for concurrency or parallelism to run on all your cores. Okay, let's look at the code. So I have a general idea what the thing is intended to do. Usually the first thing I look at when I start looking at code isn't the code itself, but I start in go.mod, and that's just to get a feel for what tools are being used or what dependencies are being used. So Go 1.15, that's a little bit old, but that's fine. This code was last modified in December 2020. So Go 1.15 was probably the latest version at that time. Go 1.17 is out now, about a year later. So yeah, Go 1.15 was the current one. I'm going to skip over the indirect dependencies to start with, because those are not things that are pulled in directly by the tool. I'm interested in the direct dependencies. So Badger, that's the database that we just looked at. Gin, that's the framework we expect. It's using Google's UUID library. And I think that's it. Those are the only direct dependencies. So it's a pretty lightweight package. That's good. All the indirect things are then things that are pulled in by one of these three direct dependencies. So I'm not really concerned about that. My main concern here is this person pulling in 1,000 things they don't need? Are they overcomplicating things with external dependencies? I would say not. This looks good so far. One thing I do notice, though, is that this package has an underscore in the name, which is not Go convention. It works, but it violates conventional Go practice. So not a red flag by any means, but it's something, if I were to interview this person, I would probably ask about that. Like, why did you choose to do that? Was there a reason? Did you just not know about the convention? All right, let's start looking at some code here. So I can see there's a main.go at the top level. That's a common way to organize a Go package, so no problem there, but let's see what's in there. All right, so it's a really simple package. That's a good thing, I think. Main.go should generally be fairly small. So it is just logs a couple things using the standard libraries logger. Not the best logger in the world, but for a simple tool, that's a good way to go. If I was doing this in an assignment for if I was doing a coding assignment, I would use the standard logger. And then it starts the Gin tool, or the Gin framework. So that's fine. Nothing too exciting here. The interesting part is handler here. So this is where it hooks into the rest of the program. It calls handler, which is this import. So that's the next place I will look to see what that handler.new does. And then max parallelism. This is actually redundant in modern versions of Go, I believe. I don't think there's any reason to do this yourself. Go will automatically do this. I don't remember which version that happened in, but you don't need to detect how many processors you have and set the number of routines. That's automatically done by default in modern Go. So actually, I'm gonna fork this project locally so I can pull it up in my IDE and use some of its tools. So let me just do that quickly. And I'll pull up the main.go here. This is nice because now I can just jump to definition. So here we're in the new function that's called from main, and it's pretty bare also. So it just creates a default gin object, calls this function on it, and then returns it. So let's see what that function does. It sets up your routes. So that's really simple too. So since this is a roast, I'm going to be a little bit harsh. One thing I don't like is the way the import statements are done. I like to put my third-party imports above my local imports. So in other words, I would put this import up here in its own group, like this. I just think it makes it easier to read. That's a nitpick. That's not something that would it would also not disqualify anybody from a job application at all. It's a nitpick. So just mentioning that for completeness sake here. So let's continue on the code review here. So this set signature routes calls. So I do wonder why this is a separate function. I mean, I guess it's okay, but this function only does one thing, and it's call this. I would honestly, I would just move this body over here and simplify the code a little bit, but not a big deal. So let's just look at the one of these here. Get public key. Pretty simple handler here. So yeah, I don't like this. Basically, if the config variable is not set, it returns an error. To me, this probably should be a startup failure. Like the service shouldn't start if the configuration isn't valid, rather than it starting and then returning errors to your clients. And the reason for that is because if this was a production service, you might not notice, or you might not notice right away if your service is misconfigured, if it starts and pretends to work but then just returns errors to clients. And furthermore, the clients probably have nothing they can do about this. I mean, if you're the consumer of this service and you get this error, public key not found, something went wrong, what can you do? Nothing. You can't do anything. The service is broken. So I don't like that aspect of it. But stepping aside from that, so I would move this check honestly into this function and have it return an error, and then that would bubble up to the top layer, and then back in main.go here, if this returns an error, potentially saying public key not found, then it would fail to start, and it would log an error and exit with a status with an exit status. So that's what I would do there. But let's continue. So supposing that it works, it returns a public key. That's fine. I do want to examine though how this configuration is handled. So this config env. Let's just jump to that definition. So we have a global variable. I don't like that either. I would much rather. Yeah, I don't like that. I mean, let me talk about why. Of course, global variables are dangerous for all the traditional reasons. Global state can be manipulated by anything in the program. But specifically, the reasons I don't like this is because it makes testing difficult. If I suppose I have a unit test, and I don't know if there's actually unit tests on this code. Let me see. It doesn't look like there is, so that would be a yellow flag at least. But supposing I wanted a unit test on this method, on this get public key handler, and I want to test it with different. So I certainly would want two tests. I would want one assertion when public key is null, and one when it's not. as this code is written right now, those tests could not run in parallel because I would need to set the global configuration value, run one test, change the public configuration variable, the global configuration value, and run a second test. And that's not optimal. It's not a big deal for this particular example, but it's not optimal. So my preferred approach would be not to use a global configuration variable, but instead to have a single configuration object that is instantiated here. So this, I would do something like conf equals config.new or whatever, and then I would pass that conf value into the handler. Now, by doing that, I still have only one, during normal operation, I have only one single configuration variable, but since it's not global, now it's passed in as state. Then down here, in this method, I would, let me extend my example here. So I would then make this, I would probably create a wrapper object. So I'll do something like this. Let's just call it router. It doesn't matter. So this method takes, this constructor takes a conf value, and then I would return something like this. Of course, I would need to pass that value into this method, but if this method then had that configuration, I could pass that down here. So get public key should have access to that configuration object. So I haven't illustrated it perfectly, since that's not really the main point I want to do here, but I hope you get the idea. If it's confusing, leave a comment. I can elaborate further in a follow-up video. But the point is that then I can run both tests in parallel, each with its own unique and distinct configuration object. So that's one thing. I would definitely bring that up in the interview if I was to interview this candidate afterwards. I would ask why they did this. I would ask how they would handle the testing scenario. I wouldn't spoon feed them the answer. I would ask, how would you solve this problem? So let's, I'm not going to dig into each of these handlers yet. I wanted to just get a feel for the structure. I am curious about tests. It doesn't look like there's any, but let's just find out here. No test file. So that is a big red flag for me. That would definitely come up in the interview. I would ask why there's no tests. I tend to prefer TDD, writing tests before code, but that's not a deal breaker either. The important thing here is I would expect there to be some tests in a project of this size, or any project really. But let's continue. Let's look at the rest. So let's look at the database here. So we have a db.go. This is also using a global database handler. That's also a red flag. I would do the exact same thing as I suggested with the config. I would instantiate the database object here, something like db. So autocomplete is not letting me fake what I want to fake. Let's do something like this. Whatever, and then I would pass the db value in there. So again, with unit tests, this makes that easier. This actually helps with several things that don't apply to config. By using a single database instance that's passed around rather than a global, it's also easier to replace your database if you ever want to. Now, I understand that's rarely done in practice, but it's easier. Oh, I also don't like this at all. I don't like this init that has a side effect. So basically, this package connects to the database when the thing is loaded. That's really bad. I would never accept this at a pull request, just to be honest. And the reasons for that are that you may need more than one database instance in some cases. It's probably rare in most applications, but you don't. If you ever get to the point where you're adding a feature that needs a second database instance, you don't want to debug this. This is going to be a nightmare to debug. So this whole package here should be replaced with a constructor method that returns. This whole thing should just be this. That's all. That's all this should be. This part should go away. So a couple reasons. Oh, I guess I need a comment here too. There. That should be the package, and this part should go away. So, and then the way that it's consumed, of course, is like I said here. This calls that. If there's an error, then this should be responsible for returning the error. You should never have a log fatal inside of a method like this. This is really bad. And the reason is because you're coupling your flow control with something that should be completely unrelated to flow control. When I ask you when I ask a module to create a database instance for me, I want it to create a database instance for me, and if it can't, return an error. I don't want it to terminate my program. That's terrible. It's impossible. It's not impossible. It's incredibly difficult to unit test this. I mean, if you want to unit test this in the failure case, actually, it is impossible. You cannot unit test this function in the failure case because it will exit the test. So that's a huge red flag. That sorry for the burn, for the roast, but that's bad. I would never allow this in a code review. That doesn't mean I wouldn't hire this person, but it does mean that once they're hired, I would not allow them to commit this code to our production database. But let's continue. Don't save. Let's look down here. So DB. Actually, let me put that up one more time. I don't know. What's this DB signature package? What does that do? So here we're returning a DAO library instance of some sort. I'm really curious where this is used. But I'll look for that. Let me just see where this is used here. It's only used one place, and it's in new service. So this part, this is interesting. Where is this used? So that I actually like that. That we're returning an instance that is embedded in an object of some sort. I don't know how this object is used yet, but at least this part I'm happy with. It's a constructor. It accepts a logger. That can be an appropriate use of a logger object, and it returns a wrapping object. So I don't mind that at all. I like that aspect of things. What else can we do here? Let me continue that exploration over here. I'm curious how this new service is used. So this is used in a couple of places. So here, what? This is a yellow flag here. It looks like we're instantiating a new instance of this service each time it's used in a controller. That's a problem, probably. Let me look more closely at the service. But what I would expect is that you instantiate this service once at the application start, and then you use it twice in two cases. So I don't think it makes sense to instantiate the service twice. Let's see what instantiating the service actually does. We close this because we know it does. It starts this. What does this do? Oh, yeah. So this is silly. It's probably the service shouldn't actually exist. So it's not actually terrible that it's doing this from an efficiency standpoint, because all that the service instantiation does is create this object that contains a logger and a reference to the global database connection. So as I mentioned before, this global database connection shouldn't exist. It should be passed in here. It should look something like this. That would be much cleaner. At least it's not actually connecting to the database. It's using an existing connection. But then that also begs the question, why call this as a constructor in the first place? So I would get rid of this constructor, and I would probably just have the functions on the object, there's two. I would probably have these just accept a database connection, and maybe a logger if the logger is actually used. I don't know if the logger, the logger is used here for debugging. It looks like the only place the logger is used. So I would have this method. I would turn it just to a regular function and have it accept a database connection, and this one accept a database connection and possibly the logger if that logging is important. Another option is to move these methods into the DB layer up here, and just have them be methods on a wrapper on the database. Which approach is taken is a little bit less important. The key that I'm trying to get at here is that I don't think this needs to be a constructor. So first, this should be a constructor, and once you have that as a constructor, you don't need this other one. So we have a global and a constructor that are conflating concepts. They should just be merged into a single constructor function. Let's continue. What else can we look at? I'm not going to go into every file because I don't think it's necessary. Let's look at configuration, though. I mentioned early on that I don't like using JSON as configuration. I've actually written a blog post about this. So I talk about in my article the things that make for good configuration, and that's what I want to talk about here. One is a good configuration file format is easy for a human to read and edit. And JSON, more or less, is that, except it doesn't support comments. And comments can be really, really important in a configuration file. So that's the main reason I don't like JSON for configuration, is it doesn't support comments. Also, good configuration format is easy for a computer to read. JSON does that. Hopefully most configuration formats do that, but there are some that don't. INI, for example, can be really difficult to read because there's no strict definition of INI. And it should be expressive. JSON is more or less expressive. It's not the most expressive. Like it's difficult to indicate that something is a floating point value versus an integer, things like that. But it's reasonably expressive. You can get around those things if you want to. And it should be easy to deploy. JSON is easy to deploy. So the main thing here, though, the main reason I don't like JSON as a config format is it doesn't support comments. So I would rather use maybe YAML or TOML. TOML is usually my go-to for config files. Considering, however, that this is a service, environment variables would be an excellent place to go and forget about a config file at all and just use environment variables. Whether that's appropriate can depend on a number of things. If you're interested, a link to that article will be in the description, so you're welcome to go read the full article. But for this, there's only 6 config values. I would definitely probably use environment variables instead of JSON. Again, that wouldn't disqualify this candidate, but it's something I would bring up in the interview to ask why they chose JSON, and how would they approach the problem if we wanted to use comments in our code, et cetera, et cetera. Back to the code. Again, I don't like this. If you're writing Go, you should almost never use an init function. Almost never. There are times when you have to, but not here. This is a big red flag. You should not use an init function to load your config. That should be a constructor function. Basically, you don't want your init functions to have side effects that might be unexpected. And I don't. If I'm loading this module, if I'm loading this package, this config package, maybe because I need access to this. That's not exported, but what's an example? There's not a good example here, but maybe I'm loading a package just because I need access to some of the types defined in it. I don't want it doing side effects, especially side effects that might exit my program with a panic. So this also goes back to what I was saying earlier about coupling your flow control with other logic. So an init function that panics because it can't find a file, terrible. It should return an error. And then the caller of the constructor can decide how to handle that error. Maybe you want to look at 3 different config file locations. This package should not be worded about that level of detail. This package should take an argument and see if it can read that file, and if it cannot, it should return an error. And let the caller decide if that means to exit or try something else or go on vacation to Hollywood. It doesn't matter. This package should not be ever concerned with when is it appropriate to exit the program. That's not the concern of a config module. Config module should read and handle configuration and report errors and nothing else. So, terrible here. This is terrible. Load config, nothing wrong with that per se. I would make this the constructor and let it return the config value and an error, and then the caller can do what it wants. So these should be merged. Get rid of this. Get rid of the global variable. Return an instance of that variable instead. I think I've gone on long enough about this. Is there anything else to look at? We have a logger here. I'm curious. Oh, it's just same as before. It's initializing a global logger. That should not be happening. This should be a constructor that returns a logger. If it can't, for some reason like this, if it can't open a file, it should return an error. So once again, don't use globals. Don't use init functions with side effects unless you absolutely have to, and there's no reason for that here. So don't do that. We have a load test. This is interesting. Let's see what we have here. I'm not familiar with what this is, but I don't think these aren't Go tests. I'm curious what they are. I don't know what these are. some kind of tests. I don't recognize this format. I'm guessing this is for some sort of API testing tool. Maybe the README talks about it. Vegata. I don't know Vegata, but apparently it does some sort of load testing, and that's what that's used for. So there are some tests here that just aren't Go tests, and they're apparently load tests, not functional tests. So certainly some functional breakage would cause a load test to fail to run, I imagine, but I would definitely look at adding tests here. There's a vendor directory. That is interesting. I don't know why they're using a vendor directory. That's a yellow flag in modern Go, especially if you're using modules. There are times that it makes sense to use Go mod with vendoring, but usually if you're using private dependencies, and this package is not. So I would definitely ask in the interview, why did you vendor your dependencies? What were you trying to solve? But not a big deal. Let's look at utils. This is the name of the package is a small red flag in my mind. Let's just see what we have. Oh, this is a separate package. It's a main package, so it's not actually a utils library, which I would have thought from the name. What does it do? Generate and write. Oh, it just generates a key pair apparently with random seeds. So that's not bad. I wouldn't call it utils because it's not very descriptive. I would probably put it a little more conventional with a Go program would be to put it in a directory called cmd/keyjan or something like that, a descriptive name. But other than the naming, I don't have any problem with this particular tool. Yeah, it doesn't really do very good error reporting, but that's okay for a tool like this. You know, it's a self-contained one file. It has three functions, four functions if you count main. So I don't have a high quality standard for something like this. It's just kind of a throwaway tool. It could definitely be improved in terms of readability and modularity, but I don't really care. I mean, this might as well be a shell script for the utility it provides, and so yeah, I don't have much to say about this one except that it's fine except for the name. I should run gofumpt on it and see if it passes. I think it will. I didn't see anything that would say it won't pass, but let's see here. So gofumpt, it because I'm using a newer version of Go locally, I have Go version 1.17, which changes these build directives. So it looks like that's the only failure here. There's a couple changes there. It's a couple white space things, really minor. And those could easily have changed with the more recent version of gofumpt. Let me run it with -s, because that does simplification as well, which I usually use. So I added a new line. I reordered the imports here a little bit. Just put them in alphabetical order. But overall, I would call this a pass on Go formatting. Yeah, there's just a few things, and that's probably mostly the result of an older version of gofumpt. So I would call this a pass. I do always run gofumpt in my CI pipeline. So if somebody were to commit this without that white space against my pipeline, it would fail, and they would be asked to reformat the code before committing again. But I call this a pass. So the point is, the author of this code has some experience with the Go tools, which is good. The only quote violations of Go standard were pretty minor. The naming of the package and vendoring, and there could be reasons for that. So I would definitely ask about that. Why did they make those choices? So I think that's where I'm gonna end today. Oh, let's look at the Docker file just for fun. That's fine. Nothing there to really be concerned about. The one thing that this makes me see is this exposed 3001. Let's see how that looks. It must be in main.go. No, it is a config variable. So this is a little bit funny. So this is a yellow. This is a minor thing. A lot of people get this wrong, so I wouldn't pick on the candidate for this. But if you're shipping in a Docker file, then why is this a configuration value at all? I have another article I've written about this. I'll put a link to that as well. But in my opinion, this should not be a configuration value. It should just be hard-coded. It should be a constant, probably in main.go, because it's never going to change. Now, if you're deploying this application sometimes via Docker and sometimes you're installing it with systemd or something like that, then that's a case for it to be uh, configuration, but it probably shouldn't be configuration. Also, let's look. So the suggestion the config JSON. So these values are already hard coded in here. If again, if we're shipping only in Docker, you could probably kill all of this configuration, make them all constants, and simplify things. Then we don't even have to ask the question of should this be JSON versus TOML or YAML or whatever, or environment variables. It looks like all of these could be made constants and simplify the code somewhat. So that's something to consider. Again, it depends on how it's being deployed. Is it always being deployed in Docker or sometimes other ways? But if it's always in Docker and you're always shipping this exact file with your binary, then just combine them, make it a constant, and simplify everybody's life. So, in summary, bonuses for not many dependencies. I like the short, small dependency graph. Small main.go is great. There were a couple examples I pointed out in the video of good constructor methods. GoFumped was great. The code looks fairly idiomatic in terms of Go. Negatives. Most configuration checks should happen at startup, not during runtime. Especially in reporting errors to the end user when they have nothing they can do about it is not good practice. Too many global variables. The init functions I don't like. They should not be necessary, and that just would make for confusing code. The lack of tests is a red flag, and the tight coupling of flow control and logic is a problem. In other words, the fatal or panic logging buried deep inside of various packages rather than returning an error. Nitpicking, non-conventional package name with an underscore in it. The import ordering was a nitpick I mentioned. I would rename the utils package to cmd/gen key or something like that. And I would eliminate much or maybe all of the configuration variables stored in the JSON. If there are variables remaining, I would use environment variables. And finally, the last question I would ask this candidate during an actual interview is, why did you vendor your dependencies? What was the goal there? So, thank you a ton to, I hope I said this right, Udaya. Thank you so much for submitting your code for a roast. I hope you don't take it too harshly. It's all done in good fun and good spirit. I hope you've learned something. I hope anybody watching has learned. If you would enjoy having your code roasted, especially if it's written in Go, which is the language I'm most familiar with at this level, leave a comment or send me an email. I would love to hear from you, and I can do another follow-up video on your code. And I hope we can all learn something together and write better code and get better jobs with our examples. So thanks. Talk to you later.